Hey guys, Danny here from DynaKinetics. I'm going to be going through in this video every step on how to assemble your very own Star Reacher kit here from DynaKinetics. Completely designed and manufactured in Australia with a 100% complete composite airframe. Okay, so crack open the kit, turn to page 1 and let's get started with the very first instruction. Alright guys, we've got our very first part that we're going to be putting inside the tube. But before we get started and cracking open this epoxy, I'd like to take a moment as well to make sure that you're wearing the correct appropriate PPE. I'm going to be wearing a latex glove on my hand for the hand that I'll be using for the epoxy as well. Definitely if you're new to this as well, use 2 gloved hands, but since I'm only going to be using my right hand to mix and apply the epoxy, I'm just going to keep one hand free also so I can continue the video. But nonetheless, let's crack on. So the very first part that we're going to be putting in is going to be the motor bulkhead. Okay, now this is going to be labeled in your kit as well that it's the bulkhead, because all these rings, they can look pretty the same unless you're going to get a caliper out and measure them. So at the back it's going to be labeled motor bulkhead. Now this motor bulkhead is designed so it actually stops your motor from actually going too far inside the rock. So when you load it, it essentially acts as a stop. So it's actually quite an important part in there. Now, to load it up, what we're going to do is we're going to use alignment tool A. And by doing that, we're going to align the ring on top and we're going to just drop the tube on top, and that's going to create a spacer essentially. It's going to position that right perfectly in the right dimensions where it needs to sit in the tube and then extract it out of the tube once the glue is started to tack. But follow along as I do this as well. A little tip as well, in case you might be new to making models or model rockets in general, is when it comes to epoxy, less is more. So always feel free, especially because I'm using 5-minute epoxy, you don't want to be making way too much and then letting it pot essentially on your applicator before you can even use it. So definitely feel free to use less. Now, the key is as well, before I forget, that you want to make sure that you get an idea, and you can use a marker, by the way. You can make a little dot just where you're going to notice that each component is going to sit. But in this case, I'm just going to be making a mental note where that is going to be sitting height-wise inside the tube. Again, I've made a few of these as well, so I'm quite versed in them. But again, feel free to make a little notch on there, especially if you're going to be planning on painting the tube as well. You won't be able to see it. So feel free to make a notch, but make at least know where that ring is going to sit, because that is where we're going to need a decent amount of epoxy on the inside of the tube. And I'm just going to place that now. And a little bit of advice as well, I would apply it maybe 5 mil. I'd apply the epoxy, I'd say just about 5 mil just before where the bulkhead is actually going to naturally sit. And the reason why is because when you do push the bulkhead inside the airframe using your alignment tool, using your tool A, it's actually going to naturally want to pick up the epoxy and scrape it, if you will. And that's a good thing, because by scraping it a little bit, just that 5 mil, evens out and distributes a bit of that epoxy, rather than just the spots that you've placed the epoxy with your applicator. Now again, I'm using 5-minute epoxy just because I am very used to making these. And I'm just used to 5-minute epoxy in general, but it doesn't mean you have to use 5-minute epoxy. You can use longer. There is 15, there is 30-minute epoxy out there, and it just means it gives you a bit extra room just to make sure everything is perfectly lined up as well, because that's important. Once this epoxy dries, once any epoxy dries, it is going to be rock solid in there. You're not going to be able to get that out. So it's definitely good getting this all lined up perfectly the first time. There we go. And I'm just, again, you won't be able to see this on camera, but I am just slowly moving that epoxy around, like I said, because I know, well, because I want the bulkhead to, again, for that last 5 millimeters before it sits in its position, to scrape and distribute that epoxy around a little bit. But you don't want too much. You don't want epoxy to get into your fin slots there. But anyway, I've applied that now. You're gonna notice that the bulkhead, along with the motor alignment tools when we get there as well, is gonna sit quite nicely and firm inside that tool. So make sure it is completely level with the tool. That's quite important. If it's not, really put it in there. But once that is, you are now able to put in your first component, the motor bulkhead. So just align this gently. Line this gently over. Now everything has been, all the components here have been laser cut and they're quite precise. So if you feel like it may just be a little stubborn getting it in there, that's okay. Just give it a little nudge. Here we go. Now again, I know it's probably difficult to see on camera, but because the composite tube is somewhat semi-transparent a little bit, you can see with a good light where it's sitting, and I can see that is perfect right there. So I'm gonna let that sit just for about maybe 10 or so minutes, really start to let that tack up, and then I'm gonna remove the tool and we're gonna head to the next step. Okay guys, now that the glue has started to tack over here for the motor bulkhead, we're gonna move on to step number 2, which is putting in the forwardmost and the most aft motor alignment ring. So let's get started with that. One more trick as well that I thought I'd mention too. When it comes to the motor alignment tools, because there's such a fine precision between these and the dimensions of your motor, before gluing them in, just grab both of your rings and just make sure that your motor is actually going to fit through those. Now, it's quite normal to feel a little bit of friction on there or a bit of grab, if you will, because these are laser cut to a really high tolerance. But if for whatever reason, if your motor doesn't fit in there, feel free to use 240 grit sandpaper and just lightly sand down the center of the ring as well. Slowly and not too much, only enough so when you start to see that the motor goes through. But otherwise, you should be good even straight out of the pack. Also, a nifty trick for all those out there who might be new to model making, make sure that you've got a bin handy. Now, you can't see it because it's actually underneath my table, but make sure you've got a bin handy that also has a bin liner. The reason why is because epoxy, well, it can kind of get everywhere, hence also the glove that I recommend that you wear. So whenever you're finished with a part, whether that be an applicator, your surface that you're putting the epoxy and mixing it together, when you're done with it, throw it away. And again, make sure it's got a bag, otherwise you're gonna find epoxy, and whether it be your applicator, is just gonna be glued to the side of your bin, and good luck trying to get rid of it. Alright guys, now just with the motor bulkhead, you're gonna find that there is a specially designed tool for the forwardmost motor aligner. And this tool is labeled Tool B, okay? And just like the motor bulkhead, you should be able to put that on top and it should nicely and snugly fit. And just like the motor bulkhead, what you're gonna do is you're just gonna put the Tool B right upside next to the tube. And again, just like before, if you want, feel free to leave a mark just so you know. But again, I've done this a few times, so I'm not gonna leave a mark. But we're gonna wanna make a mental note where that forwardmost motor aligner is gonna sit, and we're gonna apply a good amount of epoxy in there. And again, just like with the motor bulkhead, we're gonna put it a few millimeters before, just so when we do slide the tool in there, it's gonna lift that epoxy up and make a good bead around it. All right, so just like what we did with the motor bulkhead, have the motor alignment tool sitting nice and flat on top of the tool and easily put it over. Again, if you find that, just like with the motor bulkhead, if you find that it catches on the tube, it's okay. It's all been laser cut to a fine tolerance. Here we go, I can feel the epoxy catching. There we go, that is a good seal. I know I've said before, but applying the epoxy just a little bit before where the ring is actually meant to be housed, again, allows that ring to push the epoxy up a little bit and naturally create a nice bead on the inside. And just as I was lowering the airframe down over the tool. I could feel that, so that's a good sign. Again, I'm gonna let this sit just for a moment or two. I'm gonna extract the tool and then I'm gonna let it sit for about 10, 15 minutes. Also, another trick as well, which I'm just going to show you in a moment, make sure that you always keep an eye on each component that you put in there, just in case you do get a little bit of epoxy that goes onto the inner diameter of the motor aligner. Make sure you clean that up. Because again, these motor aligners have been laser cut to such precision that if there is a bit of epoxy where it might not necessarily belong, it could make putting the motor in either impossible or quite difficult. So just keep an eye on that. It's been about 10-15 minutes now. The epoxy that I applied for the forward most centering ring should have tacked over now. So now I'm just going to mix up a little bit more epoxy, and I'm now going to do the exact same step that we did with the first retaining ring, but for the aftmost facing. And it's the exact same steps as earlier, but instead of using the B tool, we're going to be using the C tool, which you're going to notice it's a fair bit shorter than the B2. Here we go again, just like we've done in previous steps, aligning this C tool up on the side of the airframe. Again, use a marker if you want. I'm just going to make a mental note where the epoxy needs to go. I'm just going to apply that accordingly. Okay, also, now that you have allowed the epoxy to tack over for the forwardmost centering ring, just like what we did with the bulkhead, apply a little bit of epoxy just to the rear of it, again, just to really add with its structural integrity. It's a good thing to have a bead of epoxy at the front, but whilst that rear ring is exposed, we're gonna just apply some to the back. Okay, just like in the previous steps, put your aftermost alignment ring on top of the tool, steadily align the airframe over and slowly, perfectly push down gently. There we go, just right until the airframe has bottomed out on your work surface. There we go. That is down perfectly. And just like we've done in previous steps, grab one of your fins and just go around all the edges and just make sure that everything fits perfectly. Again, if there is something that's off-centered, you've made a mistake, that is okay. We can fix that now. But whilst we're letting it whilst we're letting it dry over the next 10 or so minutes, at least that's okay. But otherwise, everything lines up perfectly as it should. So I'm gonna let that sit just for a little bit, extract the tool again, wait about 10-15 minutes, and we'll move on to the next step. Okay guys, in this step, we're gonna be putting in the motor locking sleeve and the motor locking ring. Now, these are designed to house the motor and make sure it's not going to come dislodged out of the rocket during flight, and also most importantly, during the ejection charge. When the ejection charge goes off, it's going to be a fair amount of energy going to be coming out of the motor to push your parachute and nose cone outside of the airframe. You want to make sure that that energy isn't also going to be transferred to the motor, so it then comes out of the aft end of the rocket. This is going to make sure it's going to be nice and locked in firm, whilst also being lightweight and quite durable too. Alright guys, so with this, we've got the motor locking sleeve, okay? Now, they're gonna be, the motor locking sleeve and the motor locking ring are gonna be in the same packet, but just so we'd make sure, it's essentially the component that has the threads on the interior of the circumference. That is what's gonna go in. Additionally, you're also gonna notice that on one side, again, you're probably not gonna notice it on camera, but on one side, to my right here, there is about a 45-degree chamfer on one side. Now that has been put there, so it's just a bit easier for you to insert this inside the rocket. So that is the part that enters. The flat bit, the one that has a 90-degree edge on it, that is going to be facing towards the aft end, which is what the locking ring is going to be accepted and threaded into. Okay, so what we're going to do is, in this case, I've already mixed up some epoxy off scene. We're just going to absolutely double check that everything lines up and that fits in there beautifully as it should. Okay, so what we're going to do now is apply not necessarily a generous amount of epoxy, because again, when it comes to the sleeve, this has been manufactured with a quite high tolerance. So you don't want to put a copious amount of epoxy onto the component, because it's only going to get squished out the end when you insert it anyway. But nonetheless, you don't want too little as well. As I mentioned earlier, there is going to be a fair amount of energy that is going to be applied and transferred essentially to these components when the ejection charge goes off. So we do want to make sure that they are nice and strong. Alright, so now make sure when you are applying the epoxy around the component, advise that you apply the epoxy to the most forward half of the component. And again, the reason why is because again, you're going to be inserting this. So all the epoxy is going to want to get squished out towards the end. If you put too much epoxy at the rear, well, most of that epoxy is actually going to just get fed out and squished out the rocket. But if you put it at the front, at least it'll be pushed back to somewhat of a happy medium inside the component as well. Now I've applied what I'd consider a fair amount of epoxy onto that. That should be good as gold. Now, very similar, just like to all the other primes we've done with the motor, the motor bulkhead and the motor alignment. It's a really simple stage. We've just got our component with the adhesive. Actually, I'm gonna put that on a piece of paper just in case I do. Yeah, that's actually another point. Put that on a piece of paper or something that you don't mind getting epoxy on, because no matter where you put the epoxy, like I said, at the first half or in the center of the component, you're naturally gonna get epoxy that's gonna want to get squished out of the tube. So definitely place that on there. And in this case, we're just gonna fit it on top, push down, you're gonna feel the epoxy grab, give that a nice little twist at the bottom, make sure it's completely flat. See if you can probably see when you do this, some epoxy sit at the bottom, but that's okay, this is on paper, and there we go, that is in there nice and tight. Now again, just using your gloved hand or a piece of cloth, just take off any excess epoxy that may have been squished out. And just like every other component that we've done so far, I'm just gonna let that sit for about 10 or so minutes, and then we'll move on to the next one. Alright guys, in this step, we're going to be putting the 3 fins into the airframe of your kit. Now, with the kit, and you've probably actually seen me already been using this throughout the video, but in your kit, you will also get a fin diagram, okay? And this template, this diagram, is just so you can place your airframe perfectly on the center of where the airframe is identified on the template. And you can actually insert each fin. And again, each one of the notches and recesses is going to fit in there perfectly. And that's good. And just give yourself a dry run when you assemble this. Just make sure everything lines up, because you're going to see the airframe, a two-dimensional drawing of the airframe, and also two-dimensional representation of where the fins need to be aligned. Now, each fin, because there's 3 on a circle, they're going to be spaced out at 120 degree rotation. So now that they're in place, essentially just start off with 1 fin. So take out 2 fins and just put them to the side. And we're just going to focus on 1 fin at a time. Now, with that completely inserted, nice and snug, just let that go. And in this case, we're going to make some more epoxy, and essentially just run epoxy right down across each side of the fin. Now, you can apply a small amount to each fin and then let it cure. So then you've at least got a bit of like a weld. You've got a bit of a tack on the fin, so you're not going to accidentally knock it and let it come. But in this step, I'm going to actually just apply the epoxy to all sides and then move on to the next fin, let it cure, move on to the next fin, let it cure, and then after that, we'll be able to get on to the next stage. But again, feel free to do what you want to do. You can put a little dab of glue, let that harden, move to the next one before putting a full bead of epoxy. It's just completely up to you. Now, to apply the epoxy, there's a few different methods you can do it. My personal favorite is, again, just by letting that sit naturally. Now, again, because this has all been cut to precision, it'll naturally just want to stand up. And what I'm going to do is just let a little bit of epoxy, not from my finger, but I'll let a little bit of epoxy just run off my applicator. And I'm just going to make a nice gentle bead and just very gently just negotiate that, massage that to the root cord where that needs to sit. And again, really the best piece of advice that I can give you on here is just time and patience. This is probably a step where, again, if this is your first model rocket kit and you might be new to making things like this, if you have been using a 5-minute epoxy, this is probably where I'd advise maybe use a longer setting epoxy. And again, it's just so it gives you more time. You're not going to feel rushed. You're not going to have epoxy starting to pot on you and get hard on the applicator. You can just take your time. But again, I'm still using 5-minute epoxy in this instance because, again, I've done this a few times. I know what to expect. There we go. Now I've done one side. Now I'm going to do the exact same what I was just doing then, but to the other side, which you won't be able to see. Just going to let it drip off the applicator, and I'm just going to let it naturally sit on the root cord of where I need it to go. And I'm just going to, again, just massage it gently where it needs to go. And again, please, if you're following along with this video step by step, don't feel that you've got to keep up with me or think that, you know, because you might be taking your time a little bit longer than what I'm doing, that you're doing something wrong. You're not. It just comes down to experience. There we go. There we go. And also, don't be mad or don't be upset if the first fillet you make might not look as good as you want it. So this right now, every rocketeer out there just started out just like you. No one's first rocket was perfect out the gate. There we go. Naturally let that sit. Now that I've applied a nice fillet of epoxy where it needs to go, just before it sets, really important. Again, your fin jig. Put your airframe back on here and make sure everything aligns up perfectly. Make sure also, again, I'll turn this around so you can see it a little bit better, but make sure your fin is perfectly pushed into the notches where it needs to go. And essentially now, again, this might seem a little counterproductive, but I personally prefer to sit and hold my my airframe with the other fins not epoxied in, but just placed in center, just so I can confirm that everything is still lined up. And I just sit here just like that, just until essentially the epoxy on that I've applied starts to tack over. Now again, you can do this different ways as well. Like I said, you can put just a little bit of epoxy, tack that down, move to the next one before applying a full seam. But this is just the way I'm doing it. So we're just gonna do that in this video here, but feel free to adapt to whatever you feel like is necessary. Alright guys, now we've come to the step where we're now going to be inserting and epoxying down the parachute retaining ring into the forward end of the airframe. Now for this, because we are inserting it at about 180 mils deep from the top end of the airframe, what I've done is I've actually just taped together two of my applicator wooden spoons together so I can get a nice a bit of epoxy in there as well. You can get creative to see what you can do to get it in there, but that's just what I advise. A bit of masking tape on the end of these just to join them together. You should be good as gold. So just like before, what we've done with the other rings as well, again, make a note how far deep down it is going to actually apply, where the tool is actually going to seat the parachute retaining ring. And from there, just like we've done in other stages, apply epoxy, insert the tool gently, let it harden, and then we'll move on to the next one. All right, now we're going to be making a mark on the outside of the airframe, which is where we're going to be putting each of the rail buttons or the launch lugs, whatever you're going to be using. Now, again, you can probably just see here, I'm just using a crude method here of using the box that the Star Reacher kit came with and just using a disposable cup. And whether you can see it or not on the camera, just put a loop of masking tape around it just to make sure it's all secure and standing up. Now, with this all secure and standing up, just grab your 30-centimeter ruler and right in between the outer circumference, between the two fins on the very end of the airframe, place your ruler. And you can just eyeball this if you're confident. You don't need to necessarily go overboard by using set squares or right angles, but just by making sure that it is completely center with the main airframe and you're not skewed, place this 30-centimeter mark of your ruler at the very end and the aft of the base of the airframe. And once you've got everything lined up correctly, using your U marker, put just a little mark, like 25 centimeters, and do the same thing for 5 centimeters at the front. Again, these two little marks, it's going to be your center point for the aftmost launch button, launch lug or rail button, and the forwardmost launch lug or rail button. Now, you may or may not be able to see that on camera, but I've just got a very, very faint purple mark in either sections there. And now that we've got that, again, just double check that everything's secure. We're going to mix up some epoxy, and we're just going to drop down our launch button. All right, got my mixed epoxy here, and I can clearly see the two marks that I've got that I made earlier for the launch buttons in this case. And all I'm gonna do is just put a tiny little dab, tiny dab. Even, again, you probably couldn't see that on camera, but even the amount that I just put there was too much. But that's okay, I can wipe that down. I'm just gonna spread that out a little bit. Okay. And now with that, using a gloved hand so you don't accidentally get any epoxy on you, place the base of the launch lug right on the marked spot. Now, again, because you have, or at least hopefully you've got your airframe laying down in some sort of fashion like this, so it's horizontal, so you can work above it, you don't necessarily need to hold on and make sure everything's aligned, because it should still be, even though we're working on a circumference, it should still be quite perpendicular with the airframe by standing up. So, and again, the epoxy just has a natural tackiness to it as well. So we don't need to necessarily sit here and hold anything like we kind of did with the fins. And even then with the fins, that was just me going through it quickly, just for the convenience of the video for you, the viewer. Definitely recommend, like I've said before in other steps, take your time. You know, you're better off having your epoxy pot on your applicator and then reusing another applicator rather than accidentally putting a fin the wrong way round or skewed or putting the wrong component in the wrong spot and then essentially having to somehow rip it off and then start again. But otherwise, we're gonna let this sit. Just keep an eye on it, make sure it doesn't skew off, which is fine. Again, if you've got a cloth and you think you may have applied too much epoxy, you can dab this up. You can soak a little bit of that up carefully, but otherwise I'm happy with that. And we're just gonna let that sit over the next 10-15 minutes, start to tack over a bit before we get onto really the final step, and that is applying epoxy to the anchoring point for the recovery gear on the Kevlar lines. All right, see you on the next step. All right guys, final step here. Now really, all we're doing is right now, at the very end of the parachute, you're gonna notice that there is a very small aluminium crimp and a small loop. Now this loop will probably be a couple of millimeters in diameter, But essentially this crimp and loop is going to be the anchoring point for the entire parachute and recovery system as well. So you want to make sure that you are going to be using a generous amount of epoxy, but also making sure that there aren't any natural spikes or jagged edges that epoxy can naturally form once it cures. So when you do apply this with the applicator, make sure it is quite, well, for a lack of better words, smooth. Imagine the parachute is going to be running past this at high velocity when the ejection charge goes off. You don't want it to be in a position where it could tear, snag, catch, or in any way compromise the recovery gear when it's being deployed. Remember, you're going to be wanting to use this rocket for many, many launches, and each step of this produces the longevity for the rocket. So keep that in mind. Now, one more thing as well. When you do apply the epoxy to the anchoring point, make sure that the end, so in my left hand, for example, where if I was to keep running that would go to the parachute. Make sure that is actually facing outside of the rocket. Make sure when you put the anchoring point in, you don't loop it, for example. Again, like what I was just saying a moment ago regarding the jagged edges for the epoxy, you don't want to cause any situation that could arrest, hinder, or potentially even just jeopardize the parachute from deploying correctly. And by putting this the wrong way around, you definitely are going to be causing a natural tangling or choke point. So make sure that you've got the parachute, again, if you imagine on the end of this line going out, it goes to the parachute because this is about 2 meters long. You want it to be nicely ejected out. Imagine this parachute is going to be ejected at high velocity. You don't want any snags, tearing, or anything that could jeopardize that. Okay. Alright, now I'm applying the epoxy in here. And even though there's no set depth that you need to put the anchoring point, I definitely would recommend setting the anchoring point as deep as you possibly can. Whether that be attaching 2 applicators like what I did for putting in the parachute retaining ring, or just like what I'm doing, just putting the epoxy for the anchoring point as deep as possible, whatever you feel comfortable. But just like I said, you want to make sure that you're using a generous amount of epoxy because a lot of force is going to be applied to this. You don't want anything to fail. Now, inside the airframe, applied a generous amount of epoxy, and I'm just literally just going to feed this in, essentially until the aluminium crimp and that loop, which is, by the way, is there to add surface area. More surface area in the epoxy means more strength, essentially. And then once it's there, using my applicator, I'm just going to tap it down so it really sits in that amount of epoxy that's there. And then I'm going to put more on top of it, and essentially, I'm going to let that completely cure again for another 24 hours. Hey guys, congratulations on finishing your first Star Reacher kit. I hope you have as much fun with it as I have over the years of engineering this. And please also, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and my team. As I've mentioned, these kits, along with all of the components, are designed and made right here in Australia using precision machining technology as well. So we'd only be more than happy to help you out with any questions that you may have. But until then, stay safe and we'll see you on the launch pad.